We find ourselves in Torah portion number 4 from the book of Exodus, of course, 16th overall, and it's called Beshalach. And Beshalach means when he sent out, and of course, that's in reference to Pharaoh finally letting the Israeli people go from the land of Egypt. And of course, this portion covers Exodus 13:17 through the chapter 17 itself. And there's a lot of stuff going down, of course when you come to this portion in and of itself, it is so saturated with the presence of water that I've never considered that before up until this read through. Because you have the crossing of the sea, you have the Song of Miriam, and then you also have the bitter waters that are made sweet. And it probably shouldn't come as a huge surprise that Moses is affiliated with so many consecutive stories of water, even through the rest of the Torah. And the reason I say that is when you go look at the national history of even, say, the patriarchs, those of Israel, every single one of the patriarchs are affiliated with water in pretty substantial ways. All the way back in the beginning with Abraham, you find that he was known for punching a lot of wells and creating a bunch of wells throughout the land. Well, fast forward a generation with Isaac, we find that there are some invaders and some people who come in, and Isaac is actually having disputes over wells, I think 3 different times, with the people. In addition to that, Abraham, whenever he sent out his servant, who we all believe to be Eliezer, to find a bride for his son, the son of the covenant, the son of promise, where does Eliezer meet the bride at? He actually meets Isaac's bride, Rebecca, at a well. Go forward another generation, we find a similar happenstance with Jacob. He finds Rachel at the well, and then whenever Jacob is actually shepherding all of these animals, taking care of the flocks, we find like the census explosion for all of his animals because he uses a wooden rod in a water trough. And so we find all of them directly affiliated with water. And whenever you read this portion, one of the very first things you get 3 verses in, and it talks about how Moses is actually carrying, or the people of Israel are carrying the bones of Joseph out of Egypt. And even Joseph himself, I feel indirectly, is also affiliated with water. And here's what I mean by that. When you go back to Genesis 37, it talks about how the brethren seen Joseph from afar. How was it that they were able to tell who Joseph was, even though he wasn't right on top of them? Well, the simple answer to that is his robe. And his robe is what is called in Hebrew a ketonet pasim. We translate it as a multicolored tunic, colorful garment, rainbow garment, embroidered patchwork garment. There's a lot of different things that it kind of ushers over to in the English. But again, it's a ketonet pasim. But more on that later. Whenever they grab Joseph, they strip him of his coat, they throw him into the pit. The Bible makes a special distinction that this pit is without water. And so when it comes to the brethren, who was Joseph to them? He was an absolute nobody. He was a stuck up kid that had his nose in his father's business and liked to put them down as secondary citizens, again, as far as they were concerned. He was everything to their father Jacob, but he was nothing among the brethren. Even through a handful of exchanges, you find that he goes to be the servant into slavery in the land of Egypt. He gains prominence and he gains importance, but to a general populace, he's nobody. But we find this meteoric ascension. We find that he has this rise to where he becomes absolutely number 2 in the land, only second to Pharaoh's throne itself. And in the relationship that he has, does Joseph with Pharaoh, how does that come about? He's actually able to successfully interpret a couple of dreams of Pharaoh, and one of them is where Pharaoh is standing by the Nile River. He went from somebody on a national level of not being very significant only to one but the Father, to where he is actually the one, like the Nile River, helping bring nourishment in life to the entire world. And so I find that kind of interesting. So I think with that as a prelude to the limited history that we have of Israel, we shouldn't find it too terribly surprising that Moses is affiliated with successive stories of water. As a matter of fact, with Moses, we find that the water helped preserve his life, the Nile River. We also find that whenever God was using the beginning stages of the signs, the wonders, and plagues, the Nile was turned to the blood by proxy with Moses with Aaron. And so again, I don't think it should be something very too surprising to us. And so when you get to Exodus chapter 14, you find that they're about to cross the Red Sea. And one of the things I find interesting is like they're about to finally leave the stranglehold of Egypt. But how was the stranglehold of Egypt on them at all to begin with? Well, you got to go back to Genesis 37 whenever the brothers put the knives in the back of Joseph. Joseph was the one who was literally cast from the promised land to the land of Egypt. And he was able to be the savior of the world because of the staging that was set. And then Israel found salvation, they found deliverance in Egypt. Well, whenever the table absolutely turned, all the cards had flipped against them, all of a sudden you find later on that there is a man by the name of Joshua who was the successor, who winds up being an eventual grandson of Joseph himself. And we actually find that he takes the people from the land of bondage in Egypt and helps bring them back to the promised land that Joseph, it was almost like a reverse mirror image. And these two men are the only ones to have lived in the Bible 110 years. But it all started with them stripping Joseph of his coat, that ketonet pasim. And here's what I want to mention about pasim. It's a four-letter word in Hebrew, and if you take it just straight down the middle, you can separate it into two distinct respective words. You have the word pas, and then you have the word yom. Pas, it actually means to divide. It means to split. Then you have the word yom, which is the word for sea. It all started whenever they stripped Joseph of his garment, all the way back in the book of Genesis, chapter 37. And then you find the bones of Joseph being carried through this Red Sea. And with Joseph's bones being present, you actually find almost encoded in this whole situation, the sea splits. The whole thing of the sea splitting always started back with Joseph being sent over to Egypt. And that's one of the reasons I love studying the Hebrew language, because it is absolutely smattered and peppered with little coincidental insights. A lot of people would say it's odd. Maybe it's not odd. Maybe it's God. Who knows? But we find in Exodus 14, the people they get to, let's see here. I want to go to verse 8. And the Lord had hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel. And here's what's funny. You find that through these successive plagues that had happened earlier on, even Pharaoh's court saying, hey, how long are you going to keep these people around? Because their presence alone is decimating Egypt. You need to cut your losses, let them go. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Well, we finally see where the resolve of Pharaoh is broken, and he finally lets the people go. Well, guess what? In chapter 14, we find that resolve is quickly broken again, and they decide that they're going to send like these 600 chariots off to wrangle the people and bring them back. And what's Israel's response to this? Well, if you read in verse 11 of chapter 14, they say that Moses, the whole reason we had to leave Egypt was it because we're out of graves? You brought us so far outside the land so that way we could be killed and we could be buried out here as opposed to there. And I think you and I know we have the power of hindsight. We have the power of knowing what happened in history while they were living through it in real time. And I believe you and I would know that with the plagues of Egypt, it was helping bring distinction between God's people and the people of the world, the people who are the promised seed of Abraham and the people of Egypt. Sometimes I wonder when I read these stories, the most recent couple read throughs I've done of the Bible, sometimes I can't help but wonder if the people really questioned that God was on their side, that they just so happened to get out at an opportune time. Maybe they don't realize these plagues and everything were done for their benefit. And I almost think that would be hard for them to think along those lines because there was distinctions. You know, we had talked about how the wild animals didn't affect really the Israeli people. We find that even while there was this heavy darkness that was over the land of Egypt, they still had light. And so I would like to think that they would have picked up these distinctions and realized that there was favor to them amongst the tribulations happening in the land. But I don't know. And whenever you read verses like this, it kind of helps you wonder, maybe, maybe not. And keep in mind, it just says even with the men, these were 600,000 plus individuals. That's not talking about the people who were above and below service land for uh, military. It's not talking about the women either. So it's not including the elderly, the young, or the women. So there's probably always going to be this remnant of people who are really going to question, am I not? Is God not? So maybe that's more fair to say. But even the people start turning against Moses and they're saying, hey, didn't we tell you to leave us alone? We're happy enough. We're content here in Egypt. And Moses has to tell the people not to be afraid because they're going to see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish to you this day. Fun fact, the word for salvation, it's the word Yeshua. It's literally what you and I would define in our modern vernacular. Yeshua is Jesus. He will accomplish that today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will see no more again forever. And I love verse 15. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. I think sometimes the path is set and the path is clear of what it is we want to do or what it is we really need to do. And I think sometimes we get so caught up, well, just let me pray more about it. I think God sometimes tells us, why are you still spending time stalling? Why are you spending this time in delay? You know what to do. Now go. Put up, shut up, go. Maybe that's a little bit harsh to say, but it says, lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea, and I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will follow him. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and all of his army, chariots, and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and I have gained the honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And talks about there is the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and there was the pillar of cloud that went before them and stood behind them. And so you find that they have this shelter, they have this salvation to where they're safe. Then you also find that there was this cloud of darkness that was given, and it gave light by night, and then to the other, the Egyptians. And so you find that God is intervening in this special way, protecting one side and stymieing the other. And of course, Moses stretched his hand out over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind of the night, and made the sea into dry land. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them, and they're not in the right on the left. And I think it's interesting because we see here in the Exodus, talking about the presence of Joshua, we also talk about the presence of Joseph and how they're almost mirror images of each other running north south. Uh, you actually find here that God used these waters and turned them into walls. Where in the case of Joshua, whenever they get to Jericho way later on, it's almost like he turns these walls into water themselves. God is able to do these miraculous things through the presences of these individuals because they're his people. And so, of course, we know the story. They start going through the dry land in the midst of the sea. And as they get to the other side, the Egyptians come in thinking they're going to kick butt, they're going to take names, and they're going to reclaim their hostages. And it turns out the waters crash and they eradicate the Egyptian army. And it says the children of Israel walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and to their left. And then we find in chapter 15, there is going to be what is called the Song of Moses. And obviously, you're free and welcome to read it for yourself. But what I find interesting is we find the very first time Miriam is ever name dropped in the scriptures. And of course, Miriam is the elder sister of both Moses and Aaron. But when she's introduced here, it says that she is the sister of Aaron. Why is that? I don't know. I just thought maybe you could tell that to me. But I find it interesting because this isn't the first time that we actually find Miriam in Scripture. This is just the first time that we see her name dropped. She was the one who actually placed the child, baby Moses, into the Nile River. And it's interesting because whenever you take the name Miriam, you take the one that sounds R, it's the letter Resh in Hebrew. If you take the letter Resh outside of her name, you're literally left with the Hebrew word Mayim, which means water. And so often of the time, as I mentioned, when you find prominent characters and individuals in the history of Israel, they're somehow, some way going to be affiliated with water. Like I said, you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and directly you have Joseph. Joseph's bones were present during the parting of the Red Sea. You also have Moses, who, through various chapters, as I said in the Torah, he's affiliated with water. In Miriam, when you take a look at Israel, whenever they're going through the desert and they're making this 40-year journey, it talks about there's this rock that provides them with the water that seemingly follows them all around the desert. In Rabbinic Judaism, they actually called that rock Miriam's well. And so I find that something to be of a little bit of interest because even her name contains the word water as well. And of course, she has the song here as well. And so these are just some thoughts that I had. It was going to be a little bit heavy. We're going to have a part 2 that is going to talk about the events of Exodus 16 and 17. But as spacious and as wide as the topics are in this portion, I didn't want to have one teaching that was about 40 to 45 minutes. I wanted to have a couple of them that were on the smaller side. I'm trying to condense these down to roughly 20 to 25 minutes a piece, maybe a little bit more overhang. But I just find it interesting, all these details that are given and about how strong the presence of water is through Scripture. And so, thank you for your time. As always, be blessed. And when we come back for part 2, we're actually going to start on Exodus 15, verse 22, and then we're going to close everything out. So it's not quite down the middle as I said it was going to be, but just a heads up. So, as always, thank you for your time. Be blessed.